Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. I am going to try again, and this time use another approach to discussing Zionism and by extension, imperialism in general. This time, I'm going to use the perspective that was developed by a guy named Eric Bonds. He wrote a book called Social Problems, a Human Rights Perspective. I would recommend that you read it. Now, let me give you a qualification on that. When I use the book in my classes, in my social problems classes, I was very critical of the book. And let me tell you why. Because essentially what Eric Bonds did is he used the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a standard for what human rights should be. As I would point out to my students, that in and of itself is somewhat problematic. Because what is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? It is a document that was written by various people, various nations. Most of it is drawn from the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of the United States. So it is a very, I guess you could say, Amerocentric document. The perspective on human rights that was developed by the UN. Now, there is a reason why they did it. And I think the reason may be more important than the document itself. The reason was because World War II had just ended. The United Nations had just been formed. And in that particular time, it was literally right after World War II, and by definition, right after the Nazi Holocaust. And so there was a lot of worldwide anger and angst about what to do. How do we prevent a problem like this from happening in the future? Obviously, by this time, Hitler was out of power. The Germans were already extremely apologetic for what happened. That notion of being apologetic has continued to the present day, given the fact that Germany is the second largest supporter of Israel after the United States. So, although I'm not pleased, honestly, that Germany is supporting Israel, I can understand it. I mean, if I were in that situation, if I had just been in a country where Adolf Hitler was the head of state and where he actually designed a plan to exterminate millions of Jews, and not only Jews, also Gypsies, Roman Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others, but primarily Jews. Jews were his primary target. And Hitler's Bible, for lack of a better term, was the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. If you have a strong enough stomach, you can find it online and read it. It is a forgery. There was never any protocol of the learned elders of Zion. It was based upon a work of fiction from the 19th century. An anti-Semite got a hold of it, and he took all the characters, all these evil characters in the book, and replaced them with Jews, and made it sound like he had discovered this secret plan of Jews to take over the world. Of course, there never has been such a plan. It's pure imagination. But for Hitler, that book was extraordinarily convenient. It gave him a justification for doing what he did, well, not only in Germany, but in many other countries around Germany. I mean, the Holocaust was not exclusively in Germany, although Germany certainly was the center. Basically, Hitler was opposed to anyone who, in his view, was not Aryan, which is kind of weird, considering that Hitler himself had dark hair. If there is any country that might have a right, borderline right, to claim to be Aryan, it is the Iranians. At least they live in that part of the world where the Aryans were. And the word Iran is the Persian cognate for Aryan. So you could argue a bit that the Aryans are Iran. Maybe. I would be careful about doing that. I would want to make a lot of qualifications before saying it, but still, that would be a much better argument than claiming that Germany was Aryan, when it obviously had no historical connections to Aryanism. So again, World War II had ended. Germans were very, very upset. They were angry at Hitler, justifiably. He had besmirched the name of Germany. He had done such horrendous things that were, on some ways, unparalleled, although, of course, there had been other diasporas before the Holocaust, like the Armenian Holocaust by the Turks, which till this day, the Turks have refused to officially acknowledge. And I don't know why. Maybe it's pride. But it makes no sense to me. Why not simply say, yes, we were the ones who perpetrated the Armenian Holocaust? Regardless, that's off topic. Main thing is that Germany had done this really atrocious act, and they certainly had a reason to be repentant. I mean, if I had lived in Germany, I would have felt awful, even though, of course, I am from a Jewish background. So most likely I would not have survived. I most likely would have been killed by Nazi Germany. At least that's what I assume. Maybe not, but I assume that. And I think there is a good reason for me to assume that. But whether that would have happened or not, again, is irrelevant to what I'm saying. My point is that the Holocaust that occurred inside of Germany and even outside of Germany was certainly a reason for Germans to feel guilty. I mean, if there was ever a reason for any nation to feel guilty, it was it was the Holocaust that was committed by Germany, by Hitler and his cronies against the Jews. Now, back to the subject. The UN, again, in its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, came up with a system of what human rights are. And again, they based it mostly on the US Bill of Rights and Constitution. That's what it was based on. You can actually find not exact phrasings, but paraphrases from those American documents in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not hard to see why they picked that. I mean, after all, the United States led the Allied powers to victory in Germany, although Russia, the former Soviet Union, contributed a lot more than the US did. They lost a lot more people in World War II than did the US. Still, the US was given that distinction. And so after World War II, when the Cold War started, the US became the undisputed leader of the First World, of the American Empire. Now, again, my criticism of that book is, why should I accept a definition of human rights that was created by the UN? For example, say I wrote my own Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Let's call it Marx's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I published it. Would my document, would my declaration be any less worthy of consideration than the one produced by the UN? In my view, no, absolutely not. They are simply human documents. Now, I am not criticizing in an absolute sense the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think much of it is quite good. And it certainly made a contribution to our understanding of human rights, which did not exist prior to World War II. So I think in that sense, it was good, quite good. And I also would point that out to my students, that I was not dismissing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I was simply arguing that the fact that it became that declaration was purely a matter of happenstance. I mean, what else could it be? Because any body or individual could have produced a similar document or a different document. The Jordanians, for example, have produced, in my view, what is a splendid document on human rights. I really like it. In some ways, I like it better than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So why is the Jordanian document not accorded the same level of privilege, the same level of respect that the UN document is? I don't know. I guess because it wasn't made by the UN. And the UN was a new body. It replaced, in effect, the failed League of Nations. The reason why the League of Nations failed, in case you didn't know this, was because the United States refused to join. I don't understand why they didn't join either. I mean, all of this stuff is kind of a mystery to me. So I'm talking about things that are really, really unclear to me. But regardless, the US did refuse to join the League of Nations. As a result, the League of Nations collapsed. So after World War II, they tried again. But what happened? Well, we've ended up with this system of vetoes where certain countries, such as the United States and the former Soviet Union, now Russia, has complete veto power in the United Nations Security Council, meaning if they disagree with a particular proposal, a particular condemnation given to a nation, their veto stands. Nobody can do anything about it. Nobody can challenge it officially. I guess informally they can, but they can't challenge it on paper. There's nothing anybody can do about it. Is it understandable why the US and the former Soviet Union, among others, were given that veto power? Yes, it's understandable, tragic, but understandable, given the fact that the US and the former Soviet Union had led the Allied powers to victory over the Axis powers, which were Germany, Italy, and Japan. Well, okay. So it makes some sense to have given the United States and the Soviet Union, now Russia, that kind of veto power. But what that has done, it has made the United Nations a failed body, because any condemnation of any nation, let's just pick for the sake of arbitrary reasoning, Israel, is dead on arrival, because the United States has been relatively consistent, not entirely consistent, but relatively consistent in vetoing any kind of condemnation made against Israel. And so that is the way it has remained. Israel seems relatively impervious to criticism. I mean, you can criticize it, but it has no legal standing. If the US condemns that criticism or it vetoes it, then it's as if that criticism was never even made. That's the problem with it. It's really a kind of, well, it's a document on human rights, but it's not a very effective one. And I think that most scholars who have looked at it, have recognized that really the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a failure and always has been a failure. And yet, according to the book, Social Problems, a Human Rights Perspective, that document should be regarded as the absolute standard for human rights. Why? I don't know. I can't answer that question. And I don't think there really is an answer. The only answer is that the US and the Soviet Union emerged victorious. And they were given that veto power because of that. But it still makes absolutely no sense. Not only does it make no sense, but it has made the UN into a failed body. In effect, the UN can't do anything of consequence without a veto coming from the US, the Soviet Union, or one of a few other countries. So I don't see the point, honestly, of the UN. It was a good idea. Well, for that matter, so was the League of Nations a good idea. But it was a good idea which has failed, completely failed. So, my point. Why define human rights based on a document written by the United Nations? I cannot come up with an answer to that question. And yet that is what this book did. And in the book, Social Problems, A Human Rights Perspective, the author tries to defend that. I don't know why, but he does. He argues that we should consider a social problem to be a social problem if it is a violation of human rights as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Again, it makes no sense. None of it makes any sense. It is nothing but a tragedy. Nothing but a tragedy. Nothing has ever come of it. If you define human rights based on a document written by human beings, I can say, what gives those human beings exceptional power and authority? And who can challenge me? Well, I guess they can if they want to, but on what basis? There really is no basis for challenging me. And so the result is that we really have not come up with a way of defining human rights, at least not a way which is accepted universally. We've tried, or some nations have tried. The United Nations has tried, but it's not been very successful. And so in place of a document on human rights by the UN, we have a charter which is basically a reflection of US law. That is a failure from the beginning. Why should I, even as an American, accept the legitimacy of US law? Why should I, as an American, accept that US law should become a universal standard for human rights? In fact, I don't. I don't. I don't accept that. Nor do I accept that the United Nations document is a standard, a universal standard for what is human rights. Okay, so that is the point that I made to my students. Despite the fact that that was one of the textbooks that we used in my social problems class. Now, part of why I picked it, that book, in other words, is so I could critique it. Because the author was pretending, and I think pretending is the best word for it, to have developed a form of moral realism. In other words, that morality is real. Well, I believe that as a critical realist. I believe that morality is real. I don't believe it is constructed. I believe that morality is a part of nature. And we learn, or we can learn, morality from our experiences living as a part of nature and being literally natural beings. That teaches us morality. We don't really have to go further than that. So that, as a standard for human rights, would make sense to me. Saying that morality is a part of nature, we learn morality from nature, and we should live our lives according to what we learn. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is simply a, well, I'll say flawed, arguably flawed human document. And so why should I treat it or privilege it any more than I would privilege any other document? The answer is I don't. I'm not even sure if the author does. Maybe he does. I don't know. But if he does, I think he is sorely mistaken. Sorely mistaken. There is no basis for considering or defining human rights based on a document written by people. And if somebody has a justification for that, I would like to hear it. I don't think there is any. Because you're simply talking about human opinions. You can have your opinion on human rights. I can have my opinion on human rights. Fine. Where has that gotten us? Nowhere. Nowhere at all. And so we are left in a quagmire. A quagmire really of our own creation. We are the ones who decided that human rights should be decided by the UN. Okay? We've made that decision. Now, how was that implemented? It can't be implemented. It has never been implemented. And so we live in a world without a real standard for what human rights is. Now, let's bring this down to imperialism and Zionism. Israel can claim that what it does is within the confines of human rights. They can claim that all they want, and they do. Certainly Benjamin Netanyahu makes that claim all the time, as do other members of his government. So what? So what? He makes a claim. I can make a counterclaim and say, no, it's not. And so we are simply left with a tautology, circular reasoning. There is literally no way of resolving the situation because we have never effectively defined human rights. Certainly, massacring Gazans to such an unprecedented extent must be considered a violation of human rights. And if not, there is no such thing as human rights. We might as well just take the concept of human rights and chuck it out the window. Because if what is happening to the Gazans is not a violation of human rights, then nothing is. There is no such thing as human rights. Now, let me bring this around to my own way of looking at it, which is obviously different from this book that I used to use in my social problems classes. I accept Roy Bhaskar's definition of morality. To Roy, morality is real. Now, this book may claim that it believes that morality is real too, but it's wrong. All the book is doing is taking a document and accepting it on face value. But if I say that morality is a part of the substance of the universe, a part of the substance of our own human natures, and that we learn morality by living our lives, that's moral realism. The opposite of moral relativism, which I don't accept. I reject moral relativism. I believe that morality is a real thing. It is something that we can acquire from the universe. It is something that we can acquire from ourselves. We don't need a document to tell us what it is. All a document can do is to codify the views of certain writers on what human rights is according to them, but it cannot establish any kind of real concept of morality. And so what I would say is that in spite of the claim that social problems, a human rights perspective, presents an approach to moral realism, the opposite is true. It presents an approach to moral relativism because it defines morality relative to what the authors of that document believed were true. That's moral relativism. That's not moral realism. And as a moral realist, I honestly resent the attempt by the United Nations to claim that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights establishes a standard of moral realism when it clearly does not. It clearly does not. It is simply a fabrication by human beings who may, I'm not questioning their sincerity. They may be perfectly sincere in what they believe, but who cares? Sincerity won't get you anything. What we need are actual human rights. Actual human rights. Not somebody's social construction of what those human rights should be. And in fact, we don't have one. And so we see the consequences. They're evident before us. In Gaza, we see what is happening in Gaza. We see it. It's evident. It's not difficult to discern. We see that all of these hospitals have been destroyed, and now that every single university in Gaza has also been destroyed. That is not a difficult thing to understand. That is the situation that exists right now in Gaza. And yet, the US remains the primary defender of Israel to do what it has been doing in Gaza. So I guess my question is this: is there a solution? I would say that within the framework of the first world, the empire or the American empire, the answer to that question is clear. The answer is no. Because the first world has been taking us down the wrong path for decades. We can't put any faith in the first world. There is no logic to accepting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the standard for human rights the world over. And so we're in this situation where we have not come up with a workable definition of human rights. We've not. Have we tried? Maybe. Sometimes I don't think so, or I don't think so that much. Because I think if we would have tried, sincerely tried, we could have done it. We human beings are not stupid, although we sometimes act like we are. But we're not stupid. We have very highly evolved brains. If we were inclined to develop a universal standard of human rights based on moral realism, not moral relativism, I am convinced that we could do it. And so, what does that tell us? We are not committed to developing a universal standard of human rights. Instead, we stand by and watch an entire population be massacred, and we do nothing about it. We simply are witnesses. Being a witness is good. It's always good being a witness to inhumanity. But being a witness is never far enough. If you are simply a witness, but you don't take that further and actually become an activist, a revolutionary, somebody who promotes human rights, then who cares? Who cares if you're a witness? I don't. I don't care at all. It makes literally no difference to me whatsoever. I see what is happening. And you do too. We all do. Unless we are living somewhere in a tunnel. There is no way that we cannot be witnesses to the tremendous inhumanity which is existing in the world today. But there is also no way that I, acting as an individual, can do anything about it. I can't resolve the problem. I'm a single person. I have no political power. I have no ability to force nations to do some things and prevent them from doing others. That's obvious. I don't. None of us does. And what I'm wondering is, does any nation have that power? I am not sure. If they do have that power, they are certainly not exhibiting it. They are showing, if anything, their complete impotence to solve one of the greatest problems of the time we are living in. And I don't think that is an exaggeration. We are observing it. We are witnessing it. But we are letting it pass by without taking any action, any concrete action, at least not that I can see of, to prevent it. This has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.